Welcome to What a Word is Worth, a space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano. I am the founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are giving us medicine. Today, my guest is Ravi Shankar, who is a Pushcart Prize-winning poet and editor of more than 15 books and chapbooks of poetry, whose work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, and PBS NewsHour. He is the founder of Drunken Boat, one of the world's oldest electronic journals of the arts. Ravi recently published his memoir, Correctional. About this publication, H. Bruce Franklin writes, "A brave voyage of discovery, Correctional is a real odyssey, barely making it home after navigating treacherous cultural and psychological waters." Thanks for Shankar's brilliant writing and admirable honesty, we relive his harrowing but eventually inspiring personal saga, and his deep insights into our justice system are alone worth the price of admission. That is beautiful and so well said. So welcome, Ravi. So happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Marianela. It's wonderful to speak with you, and I totally support your mission because I think words do have the capacity to heal.
Yes. So that I hope that's what you and I are gonna do, is to just dive into this world of palabras. So, the podcast is about words' potential to generate collective healing. And I want to start you with this question. Do you remember the first time you realized words have poetry in them? And have you found the healing balm in poetry? And if you did, which I think, judging by what you just said, you did, how can you talk about that process?
Yeah, and this book, Correctional, of course, is many narratives strung together, and one of which describes my growing up in Northern Virginia as a South Asian immigrant. And that experience, helped shape my perceptions, I think. But one of the things my parents used to do, they were devoutly Hindu, they're still alive today, and we would go to temples. There's a big one in Pittsburgh and another one in DC, and all of the liturgy was in Sanskrit. And I didn't understand Sanskrit, but I remember going as a young boy and feeling deeply moved by these Vedic chants that I didn't understand and yet somehow still spoke to me, to my bloodstream in this way. And I think that in some ways was my introduction to poetry. I like what Walter Pater says, that poetry is language that aspires to the condition of music. And I kind of felt really moved and even some semblance of awakening. And yet, if you ask me, well, what did the Vaidya, the priest, say in Sanskrit? I had no idea. So I think that was one moment. And then throughout my life, I've found solace in poetry. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's the most distilled and compact of the art forms. And it can really, the right poem kind of rip your heart wide open. And so that certainly happened to me quite a bit.
Yeah, and that's as you know, I work with what we call bibliopoetry therapy, and John Fox, one of the people who had taken poetry therapy out into the world, that he speaks about the capacity of the poet to distill sentiments and emotions into the poetry. So, yeah, and I know since 2008, you have been in a journey, quite a journey. That was about the time, not long after that, was when I invited you to read a Confluencia. I don't know if you remember the
Yes.
poetry series I ran at Naugatuck Valley Community College. And the
Yeah.
students fell in love with your poetry. And of course, I had invited you because of how impressed I was by your poetry. So I know I can get a sense of how you established that connection with those words, the Sanskrit words that didn't have a literal meaning, but they have some resonance. That's probably what we called a somatic language, right? That was
Yeah.
speaking to you. But in the introduction to your memoir, you describe your encounter with a woman astrologer in Chennai who told you your life was going to be threaded by both fame and hardship. And she attributed that to past lives, misdeeds, and a rare planetary, I guess, misalignment at your birth. What role did that prediction play, if any, in the formation of your identity, your
Oh,
sense of self?
oh,
Having been told that early on, right?
yeah. No, I was a young boy when that happened.
Yeah.
And what an interesting question that I've never been asked before. And
Hmm.
I think, well, first of all, I think I dismissed it initially because I thought, oh,
Hmm.
well, it's all superstitious hoo-ha, and but
But
what would
words
mark
have
my
weight.
identity? But I think it marked my identity in that it happened during this period that I describe in the book, where after starting my life in Northern Virginia, we picked up and left to take care of my grandmother who had cancer, and I lived in India for 18 months. And so this was one of many memories of a life far different than the life I had become accustomed to in America. And I can still, when I think back on it, think of those rich smells. And she had a lot of old manuscripts, which were kind of leaves that were bound together in some way, and the smell of sandalwood and the leathery touch of her hand, and all of those memories I still really vividly remember. And then this idea that your destiny could be written on your hand in some way.
Mhm.
And I have to say that as I've gotten older, rather than grow more skeptical and cynical, I think I have become immersed by the idea that mystery and all kinds of knowledge that we're only faintly aware of are possible. And in fact, and whether it was because I was kind of given this fate and I felt subconsciously I had to live into it, or whether it just happened because she was able to tap into some cosmic vein of knowledge, certainly a lot of what she said has come true. So that makes me reconsider also, because she was a kind of a kurati, a woman who was very poor, and yet she had this ability, and so people in the village all respected her for her predictive ability.
So
And
she will
so,
be like what we call in Spanish a curandera, like a
uh-huh,
healer, or well, she was an astrologer, which they tend to be healers as well.
yeah.
So you're saying you never thought much. I mean, you did write about in the book. That's how. So that it did something to you. It did something to your sense of identity.
Well, yes, and I think
Mm.
the other thing it did is when I moved back to the US, I was all of a sudden possessed with this knowledge that and experience that none of my classmates had. And it was both a kind of a curse and a blessing in some ways. It made me different from the other kids, and yet if I was being bullied or racially harassed in some way, I could always take solace in the fact that I had experienced this whole side of the world that these guys were making fun of me knew nothing about. And I think in the book, I trace out this really strange feeling of growing up, both with this idea of my parents are, in India, there's still, sadly, the vestiges of the caste system
Yeah.
exist there. And my parents
Right.
are actually Tamilian Brahmin. And they raised us, there's this sense of kind of Brahmin exceptionalism and superiority because you don't eat meat, you don't drink alcohol. And I think my father particularly felt in some ways that made him better than other people, or other people were kind of polluted in a way that he wasn't. And, but I was kind of being fed that kind of dogma at home, while out in the world, I was actually being kind of discriminated against because I was the only South Asian. And so those two twin poles of exceptionalism and discrimination, and meanwhile, being a young boy trying to figure out who I really was, I think created this kind of third rail that I didn't look at until late in my life, as you say, when all of the stuff that I described in the memoir happened.
Yeah, it brings me back to, I don't know if you're familiar with Gloria Saldua. She was a Chicano writer, and she wrote a lot. Are you familiar with?
Yes, I do, yeah.
So she talks a lot about that fluid identity, the borderline identity, and how difficult it is to when you find yourself in between worlds. But there is also a force, a strength that she herself found in that. And I can relate to that as someone also who moves in between worlds, that there is a sense of you're not coming empty-handed, is the way I have put it in my experience, right? Like I didn't come empty-handed into the American encounter.
Oh, I like that. That's really well said. And of course, it's on both sides. When I was in India, all of a sudden I was too American, and I didn't quite fit in there as well. So, I mean, I think in some ways I feel really very much connected to the entire globe. And I think part of that is from that experience of feeling when you're in exile in both places you're meant to call home, then maybe your idea of home needs to expand.
Yeah. So your book is, I was telling you before we started the recording, that is painfully beautiful. It's so honest. It's so also, I mean, the poet, you can't help it, right? You can't leave the poet behind. So it is beautiful. I like the, the mixture of the using the letters and how you move through the whole telling of your story. In your letter to your daughters, you write, "I write to you as I might to my own younger self, except without blame." You also take pride on your courage to face your mistakes, and you write something like, "Denial is a dead end." So can you say more about your coming to terms with things, about perhaps about what seemed to me like a radical acceptance practice? You talk about especially when at the toward the end, and I don't want to give the memoir away for those who have not read it yet, but you talk about a friend was helping you with tapping, and how that led you to radical acceptance. So can you say more about that experience in these two axes that I'm saying? That you're writing to them as you might have written to your younger self, except without blame. And you are also saying denial is a dead end. So how do you reconcile those two?
Yes, and I will say I'm glad you mentioned that, because throughout the book I have this architecture of these letters, each standing for one of the 6 seasons in India. We have the monsoon season of heavy rain and the pre-vernal season, in addition to the 4 that are here. And I address one of these letters to important people in my life. And I think that much of my younger life was living in shame, of feeling like I needed to project a particular identity to satisfy my parents, and yet that would be social suicide to enact in the wider world, and that I had to put on a mask in some way. And I think through that process, I didn't have a sense of harmonious, stable identity. And I think I would like to tell my daughters, you know, who are biracial, that it's okay that you have these different sides and some of them contradict each other, and that you need to accept. I mean, I think part of this book, and this is why maybe it took me almost 7 years to write, the early drafts, I think, still had some bitterness and blame in some ways, because I think part of what I describe happens to me, and I won't give it away, but it describes this time I spent at a correctional facility in Hartford. At the time I was being promoted to full professor. And in order to really get at the truth of what happened to me, I felt I had to accept all of the sides, and to actually redeem myself. My story is really connected to the larger story of all of the people I met, and where we are as a country. And that was the kind of astonishing thing. But yes, that idea, I mean, I think it's more difficult to do than it seems. But the idea of forgiving yourself, which is what I found the most difficult thing, even that's what allows you to forgive other people. And it's very, that process of accepting and allowing that healing to happen and showing yourself to be vulnerable and someone who makes mistakes and is able to grow from it is really different than the South Asian tradition, where, you know, my mother believed, she still is a little unsure why I wrote the book. And in Indian culture, if something bad happens to you, dig a very deep hole and you push it in and you put the dirt on top, and then you never ever talk about it again. And here I am, kind of reliving and, you know, writing about these things that she is uncertain why. But I feel like I need to, in order to tell this story, I have to tell all sides of it. And part of that is coming to terms with some of my own mistakes, but also part of it is describing what I learned. And that's the beautiful thing, is that I use this phrase in the book, wabi sabi, you know, Japanese.
Yes, the Japanese.
Yeah, that the cracked pot is more beautiful than the perfectly symmetrical one. And in fact, in Japanese ceramics, they will inlay any imperfections with gold to call attention to it. And I feel like,
yeah, it's called Kenzagi.
Oh yeah, Kenzagi. Yes,
yeah.
Kenzagi.
I have a poem with that title. That's why I know it.
Oh yes, what a
I play with the concept.
I think the scar is the source of the beauty.
Yeah.
Right? And as much as we will all like to project this kind of perfection, in fact, the things that make us imperfect are ways that we can connect with one another. And I think once I allowed that to happen, then it made me much more empathetic and open to so many of the people around me that I might have usually regarded with some judgment or dismissal. After going through this very humbling experience, now I feel I'm really deeply interested, and I feel very compassionate for all of those around in a very different way.
That is so important what you're saying, Ravi. As you know, I'm a poet and I'm a psychotherapist. And, you know, when I work with people, I tell them that, yeah, exactly what you're saying. The work has to start from within first. The healing has to start home. And then once we do the healing inside, then we can go out, venture out into the world and connect with the others. And, you know, I saw in your book how, I guess, in your search for common humanity, you went through this list of people, writers who had been incarcerated, and you went through a very exhaustive kind of survey of who's out there. But then you went back to you. Exactly what you said. You went back to you. It was not, you were not justifying yourself by bringing up these people. You went back to yourself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and I think what I was doing, because, you know, my situation was also a little different in that I was a semi-public figure and my case was covered extensively by the media. I think the Hartford Courant probably published 8 or 10 articles about me, and I was only convicted of a misdemeanor. I had violated my probation by driving on a suspended license, but I was made out to seem, and I think what I realized actually, uh, pre-fake news were some of the limitations of journalism. There isn't a lot of room for nuance and complexity. And also my story, I got caught up. There was this former Republican legislator turned Hartford Courant columnist who my promotion was signed off on by the Board of Regents, who was appointed by the Democratic governor. And so it became I became a convenient political football. And then the way that it was pitched is, oh, he's shaping the impressionable young minds of our students. How dare he? And I got a lot of really hateful kinds of messages telling me to go back in the first canoe back to the mud flats in India, where I belong. God. Things like this, and which was really, and Connecticut, you've lived there for a long time. It's I still have dear friends there, and it's a beautiful place, and yet it's a place of a lot of contradictions and a lot of kind of puritanical reserve. I always think about it's always one of the top 3 richest states in the entire country per capita, but the inner city of Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, 50% live below the poverty line, and their population's a color. But we don't talk about it over our bowls of clam chowder, right? That's they say, right. Because it's a democratic state, and there's almost a smug, self-satisfied aspect in some way. But yes, I think that's part of why I felt like I had to reclaim my story. And that is what I mean. I'm a big believer in bibliotherapy too. And I think being able to tell your story to yourself first and understand it. In the incarceral facility, you have people who are telling these men's stories. They're dehumanized from the beginning. They're given a number and they're referred to by the list of crimes as if there's nothing more about them. And what I found is, in fact, they are just as human as you or I.
Absolutely. In my initial trainings as a therapist, I worked at a facility that was part of Bridgeport Hospital, and I was dealing with a lot of people who were coming directly from the prisons, and that was exactly my my learning, that the most beautiful people, the most beautiful spirits passed through my desk. And yet they came out not knowing who they were, and actually repeating some of the stories. Like there is a learned narrative then that you leave prison with. But anyway, let's go back to your memoir and the way that you structure things. You talk about feeling closer to Buddhism than you feel to Hinduism, and how often, I guess what I want to know, in Buddhism, there is this idea that, the Buddha nature is in all of us and the goodness is in all of us. So how much the writing of the memoir allowed you to tap into your inner goodness? And did the writing out the 3 poisons, delusion, greed, and hatred, did that bring you closer to kind of that Buddha nature?
Yeah, and the chapter you refer to, where I kind of described this unraveling that happened, that really did feel in Indian culture, we have this term called a Drishti, which is almost a storm that sweeps your life up and things are happening outside of your control. And I wanted to, because part of this book is an examination of how in the middle of this very successful life, I could have exploded everything that I had taken so long to build. It was an act of self-sabotage in a way.
Right.
And so I wanted to really look at that. And of course, one of the things you don't have a lot, but one of the things you have when you're incarcerated is time. And so there was a lot of time to meditate and to ruminate. And when I say that, what I really like about Buddhism is that it's a philosophy, and it's really about our satisfaction in the moment. It's not about the afterlife, but it acknowledges the fact that we all suffer and that there are these roots to suffering that we can all examine and overcome. And that if we do, we're all capable of tapping into, as you say, the inner luminous Buddha nature that we all have. And I found that really an attractive idea. And when I was telling this little chapter, I thought of each of those delusions and how in my life they had played out in some ways. And it seemed to me like that section is almost little prose poems, each named for one of these
Absolutely.
three poisons, which in traditional Buddhist cosmography, you will see depicted as the pig, the snake, and the rooster. And they're in a circle and they're all chasing each other's tail, trying to devour the one. And that's what it is kind of like, I think, is this feeling of desire and not being able to get enough, and that it's you're never quite content in some way. And I wanted to stop and say, you know, I am actually, and when I looked around me, how blessed I had been compared to many of the men that I met who didn't have the opportunities that I've had, that had really traumatic childhoods and upbringings, who oftentimes had been harassed and vilified by law enforcement from a very young age, who might have had single homes or substance abuse issues or mental health problems. But I didn't see any of that being addressed. It would be, I mean, to have someone like you or any counselor in there would have been such a benefit. And yet my experience, at least at Hartford Correctional, was these men were being re-stigmatized, re-traumatized, dysregulated, and they went back out into the world with a lesser sense of being able to productively integrate into society. And it seemed to me kind of intentional.
Yeah, yeah. It's the well, yeah. It's being written about, right? By so many, but I'm thinking Michelle Alexander's and so, and even, you know, 30 years ago, there was a social worker who wrote a book, Bread and Spirit. And he spoke about, you know, what happened, how the spirit of the poor people, of the disempowered is killed. But one of the things that I particularly, aside from what you're saying, that the three vignettes are very poetic, but the other thing that they refer me to is this idea of the voice dialogue or internal family systems, where we have these parts of us that are always advocating and protecting us, and that no part is bad, because each one is there to protect us. And, you know, if we really mine into the richness of each one of the parts, then we can get to an integration of the self. So in a way, I saw that happening too with your trilogy there.
Yeah, it's that kind of taps into the romantic metaphysical poets often would write these dialogues between body and soul in some way, where you are really kind of talking back to yourself. And I think, yes, what you were talking about, healing and radical acceptance. I mean, first you have to acknowledge the working of these forces and your unskillfulness, or I had to acknowledge my own unskillfulness in a lot of ways of dealing with my own trauma and the ways in which I was carrying forward maybe generations worth of trauma. You know, my own family history, and my father, of course, who came to the US in the 1960s, and he went to school at Howard and lived on his uncle's couch in DC right when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and they sent in the National Guard. And he never talks about it, but I know what a difficult upbringing life he had in America, very different than his idea that the streets were paved with gold and he would come as a conquering hero, which of course he wanted to continue to project to everyone in India, right? That, oh, of course things are going well, but my mother has told me that in fact he was not in a good place at all. And so that idea, I mean, I think one of the things when you go through the most awful period of your life and you're written about and on local TV, it makes you kind of immune in some ways to this idea of what other people think, which was so important in my own household too. You know, what would the aunties in India say if they ever knew? I mean, this is a refrain my mother would use. And I think a lot of times we use this kind of thinking as a way of self-surveillance and a kind of conforming principle that doesn't allow us to get real with who we really are and what we're feeling. And I think that, yes, you're right, that Buddhism allowed me in some ways to just sit with it and accept it and say, okay, you know, I have all of these sides to me, and some of them are good and some of them may have hurt people consciously or inadvertently, and yet all of it is me. And if I can kind of just accept it, I can allow myself to move forward with positivity.
Absolutely. There is a modern philosopher, her name is Mariana Ortega, and she has expanded quite a bit the work of Gloria Saldua in the borderline identity. But she created a theory that she calls multiplicitous selfhood. And it talks about the selves characterized by being between worlds, being in worlds, and becoming with the multiple worlds that we encounter. So your life has also been marked by a pluralistic reality worlds. Ortega points out, she talks about experiencing moments of paralysis, moments that she encountered when navigating the different realities of the multiplicitous selves. Can you relate to that sense of paralysis, that sense of being perhaps too crowded culturally and being afraid of not knowing who to be?
Yeah, I think that there's two sides to that. I think one is that sense of paralysis, and in my own life, one was a kind of a repetition of a cycle of kind of heedless or reckless action in some way, prevented me from actually coming to terms with what, yes, and I mean, when you're, it's easier, thankfully, for my daughters growing up now. They're both vegetarian, but when I was a young boy, no one understood what it was to be a vegetarian, and I feel now so lucky that I have these dual heritages to draw upon. But you're right. I mean, there was this sense that I'm hearing all of this stuff of what I need to do to be a good, devout Hindu Brahmin boy. And then all of this stuff about, well, if you want to just, be one of the kids and assimilate, and, you have to do this. And of course, overlaid on that, of course, is also the expectations of masculinity. I mean, I think we talk a lot about toxic masculinity, but we don't see how the roots are, where from a young age, you're not encouraged to show emotion. You're kind of, I still see some of my friends in the sanctioned way of banter is kind of making fun of each other and tearing each other down. And so growing, and then feeling also, because I did well in school, but I felt like that was another liability that made me different than others. So I wanted to hide the fact that instead of taking pride in my achievements, when I would win an award, I would feel really embarrassed, and I would want to hide it, which is, I think, a kind of an unnatural feeling in a lot of ways. And so, yes, you're right. There's a clamor there of all of these competing imperatives and voices, and you as the locus of all of these forces, and just want to be able to kind of integrate. And I think part of that is finding a community, and I think the hardest thing about what I described going through in Correctional is that I lost a lot of community through what happened. And I realized that people, if they read something in the newspapers, they will automatically kind of believe it, and they're not really necessarily interested in the other side. I know there are probably many people who will never read my book and who have a certain idea of me that's very different than who I am. And I think that's really the power of stories, and allowing people to tell their own stories.
Absolutely. And, going back to the healing, and even though you didn't say it, but the forgiveness, and how words carry both the potential to heal and the potential to hurt. The words of the police officer in New York City who wrongly arrested you for the first time in, I think it was 2008 or 7, something. I mean, reading it, it hurt me how you were treated. Do you still carry hurt, or have you metabolized those words after writing your memoir? What kind of response do they evoke now?
Yeah, I think that there's a part of trauma that is visceral, that you carry in
Hmm.
your body, and that
Yeah.
intellectually you can feel like you have processed and moved on. But in fact, almost on a cellular level, there's a book, My Grandmother's Hands, that describes
Yes.
how trauma is
It's
kind of
yeah, it's a
passed along.
beautiful book.
Yeah, but so I can still, I mean, see the picture, the kind of hatred on this officer's
Mhm.
face as he called me, slurred me, an awful name, and it is kind of branded into me. I think what I didn't realize is that after that encounter, which I write about, and I ended up suing the city of New York and winning a
Mhm.
small settlement, and my story was not at all unique. I was one of almost a million innocent New Yorkers stopped under the policy of stop and frisk,
Right.
which was deemed to make the streets safer, but in fact ended up harassing numerous innocent New Yorkers, primarily people of color. And after that encounter, I found myself doing things like, if I was driving on the highway and a cop was behind me, I would just take the next exit and just park for a second without even realizing it. Or I felt like that I was and the really hurtful thing in some ways is this happened in Manhattan, which is a place that I lived and went to graduate school, and that I considered home, and that I still think of as one of the most cosmopolitan, multicultural places on earth. And so for this to happen right in the center of Midtown Manhattan, in one of the few places that I had actually felt home at, was really very upsetting, I think. And I'm probably in some ways still kind of coming to terms with it. But in terms of forgiveness, I think I've
Mhm.
allowed myself, I mean, because when that first happened, I would have these kind of violent dreams of
Exactly.
encountering this police officer, Officer Murphy, again, and what I
Mhm.
would do, and revenge I would enact.
Mhm.
And all of
Mhm.
that was not healthy. It was almost like,
Mhm.
drinking poison myself and expecting to kill my enemy,
Right.
and over time, I realized I don't know what kind of trauma that he came from. I don't know the institutional pressures. I mean, it's come out since because now stop and frisk was found unconstitutional, and some of the
Mhm.
pressure came from the department that said you needed to have a certain amount of collars every month, and there's a competition between precincts, and you're incentivized to actually arrest people, especially people of color. And so all of those forces probably played into it, but I just still can't imagine, that kind of hatred that people carry of people who are different from them. And I really think hatred is the other side of fear.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's when you don't understand something or someone, that then you can kind of reject them. And I think part of what I hope
Mhm.
this book does is this idea of radical empathy, that if we can kind of
Yeah.
open our minds to each other, especially now, because we're in such a polarized moment,
Mhm.
people really are just yell on one side of the aisle at each other
Mhm.
in this
Mhm.
unproductive way. And I feel like, well, we're all human. We're all on this earth that we have to take care of together. These little disagreements and squabbles are distracting us from the larger purpose of why we're here. I really do truly believe that.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned My Grandmother's Hands, and one of the things that makes that book so significant for the life that we're living these days is, I mean, he goes back in history, but also by highlighting the brown, black, the blue bodies,
Mm,
and highlighting the trauma that is threaded throughout these, and how important it is to contextualize that, contextualize it, both conceptualize and contextualize it.
mm,
But also what you were saying, you have a body that still is responding to that, right? So you're still metabolizing, and
mm,
maybe the writing helped, but you're still, that you there are still vibrating hurt in your body.
mm.
And I think that's important to also honor and respect that for the sake of your own healing, your own process.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in the practice of intentional inclusion when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to workplace and other places. But what has been really demoralizing, and I'm sure it's true for anyone who's had an encounter with the criminal justice system, is that you carry the stigma forward with you. And so it's not that you've paid your debt to society and you're allowed to re-enter, but in fact, society creates obstacles every step of the way. And I think this is related to this kind of puritanical idea of shaming. You know, if you're guilty of something, you committed a criminal act and you can atone for it. If it's shame, it's not that you did something criminal, you yourself are criminal, you know, and like Hester Prynne in the Scarlet Letter, you have to wear a sign of that on your body at all times. And that's what it feels to me. I mean, even in my small experience just very recently, I'm back after going to the University of Sydney, and I did a doctorate studying the roots of mass incarceration and moved back to New England. And I was just teaching at Bryant University last year, and very thankful. I just have a misdemeanor offense. I was a former tenured professor teaching as an adjunct, and did really exceptionally well, and got great reviews, and was asked back to teach in the honors college. And a couple of days before the semester was to begin, the chair called me and said, oh, well, human resources said, because the background check results have come in and we can't have you teach. And it was, of course, at that point too late for me to get any other jobs, and left me scrambling. And I felt like, gosh, this is happening to me, someone who has advocated for and written about and done all of this work. How about all of these other people who this is impacting? And then I, just as a coda to that story, I found out that this year, as their one campus book, they're reading Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And so, you know, there's a nice irony there, right? I mean, because I think a lot of times you can practice, you can use the rhetoric, and you can have the posture of being someone who is committed to egalitarian ideals and equality and diversion. But in practice, it can be a very different story.
Very different story. As the politics, right? The politics of identity.
And this is, you know, in Connecticut, if you're arrested, the newspapers can publish your name and everything about your life, which is very different. When I was in Australia, the names of people, unless they're convicted of a crime, because they could be innocent, are not published. And so I think that there is still this drive towards kind of shaming people and saying, you're not one of us in some way. And I feel like that is such an unhealthy and sad way. And like we talked about before, it really comes from fear of, you know, what happens if I allow people who are different than me into my community, or those kinds of things.
Yeah. So I know that, as you're saying, it's being a series of events that, you know, have compacted and impacted your life. And I think in your book, I can see both the ways that you show regret. Regret is mostly related to, you know, how we have been impacted by circumstances, both emotionally and at the physical and practical level. And then remorse, which is about how what we have done has impacted others. And I think you really unpack those two. But there is an issue along the lines of what we were talking about, you know, metabolizing the hurt. There is that issue of sexual harassment accusations that you endure also. And this is, I must say, there is a delicate thing for me, since I am between two people I care for and respect a great deal. But I think it will be, I wouldn't be honoring, right, my experience of reading your process of maturation and healing if I didn't talk about this. So if the person who accused you were here, what would you say to her? after
I mean, if I
digesting?
probably would break down into tears, I think I would probably weep because it might be that we have dukkha piles from previous lifetimes, because I don't imagine that either of us intended to hurt the other in the way that we did. And, this was just right. And I write about this briefly in the epilogue, but when I'm at the absolute low point of my life in China, trying to kind of recreate any semblance. And of course, I have these two beautiful daughters I have to care for. And I'm a writer, and I want to continue making my living as such. This person wrote an essay where she talks, in a really beautiful, courageous essay, I should say, where she talks about literary assault or sexual assault in the literary community, and refers to a number of different men, many accused of worse things than me, but by first initial and last, first name, last initial. And of course, this was created a kind of cloak of cover for many of the American sounding guys. But me, the Ravi S in the community, I was accused of kissing her in a crowded hotel room, and then on the mouth, and then leaving, which is honestly something that I don't remember, but it's quite possible. I mean, I'm sure it did happen, because why else would she write about it? And I was devastated to hear this. I am an avowed feminist, and I couldn't recall doing this. And I tried to engage in dialogue. And the aftermath of this was really, it's still, the reverberations hurt me today. I think I probably lost over $100,000 worth of speaking engagements, gigs, immediately. And it was as if, and I guess this is what I would ask. I mean, I think speaking our truth is so important, but our truth also doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think about, someone like the woman who accused Emmett Till of ogling her in a store, which might have actually happened, right? But then what are the ramifications? And not that I'm comparing myself in any way to someone who's a martyr in that sense, but it did really create a lot of understanding for me of this idea of intersectionality and the power that one woman could have to say this thing that happened a decade ago. And I guess what I would ask her is, why didn't you come to me first? Why couldn't we have had a conversation? I've seen you, I respect you, and I wish that we could have kind of talk to each other person to person, instead of having this accusation that was now public, that resulted in further shunning, particularly from the community I was counting on to help restore myself, which was my literary peers. And, we started a dialogue, and we were attempting to get some closure, but I think it's still a little bit of an open wound. And I think I have wanted to also, I've apologized, and I want to be able to forgive. And I think and it might be in this lifetime we don't get to the bottom of it, but I know certainly that the lessons that I've learned, I continue to impart to my daughters and to think about, because I grew up in a pretty misogynistic culture, South Asian culture. I mean, as a young boy, I would eat and my plates would magically disappear. My mother would do all of the chores and work. I actually went into my life not knowing how to, operate a vacuum cleaner or a dishwasher, much to the chagrin of former partners of mine. I've learned since then, but, and on top of that, I mean, we are in a culture where I think that we value things in the masculine that are contrary to being productive and emotional. And I think that, this person and I have so much in common. I think I would love someday for us to find common ground, but I have been, I will say, really deeply wounded and hurt. And I know that this is, something that in some ways has affected me even more than my encounter with the criminal justice system. And, I guess I feel like then maybe this is getting back to this judgmental idea of, we maybe tend to paint people with the same brush, but I feel like there needs to be a little bit of nuance sometimes, that there needs to be language. And I think we don't have language to talk about difference in gender, biological difference in a respectful way, in a way that shows nuance and complexity. And, I mean, someone like Harvey Weinstein and someone like, I forget the name of that Indian comic who apparently tried to kiss someone on a date and was, and what is this urge towards canceling someone come from anyway.
Mm.
I have found in some of the conversations I had with some of the men I met, some of them were accused of doing some awful things, and maybe as a society we'd be better off canceling them. But in fact, no, what I found was they need to be understood, and we need to kind of take them in their broken places and help them to heal, because we're actually all connected to one another in this unique way. And so anyway, I think I hope someday that we can really have a dialogue. And I like I said, if I were to see her today, I probably would cry, because it really has really deeply affected me.
You know what I'm thinking as I hear you saying this, that and you point toward the end of your memoir, you talk about the America's shadow and the importance of doing shadow work. And I think what you just said, that the complexity of that conversation goes within the understanding, where the shadows are, and the complexity of shadow work is that, once it's not easy to see the shadow. If you see it, then it's not a shadow. So,
Right.
but on page 218, you said, "This is how, in the end, the worst years of my life became my greatest blessing. I never imagined I would do time, and yet, if I hadn't, I will never have discovered the shadow self that reflects the disregarded underside of an entire country." And I think you're right on the money with that. There is someone who's lined up to come and talk, and is the writer Reggie Mara, who is writing a book on the shadow of America and looking at it. Well, I'm not gonna give out his book, but it's this contextual, historical, looking at everything. And I think you're right on the money with this one, how you're pointing out to that.
Yeah, it's the fundamental hypocrisy that we've never quite unraveled. I think that the framers of the Constitution, these puritanical men who were writing a document that guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all, were simultaneously slave owners, right? And so we haven't really reckoned, and this is what frustrates me when they have these conversations. We can't have books that make us uncomfortable in schools, or critical race theory. And I always think the best argument is just looking at statistics. Look at the median per capita income of an African-American or Hispanic-American family compared to, look at the educational resources, look at the differences that still exist. And so I think that talking about the reasons why and being able to transform things so that we're more equal is a really important strategy. And in Australia, and I have started doing this a little bit. I'm where I'm speaking to you in Providence, Rhode Island, was the home of the Narragansett Indigenous people, and they have in Australia a welcome to nation, where they acknowledge the original stewards of the land. And I know my Australian friends think, oh, it's just lip service. But I, as an American, was always really deeply moved hearing the names of these Indigenous groups. And I felt like it must shift things somehow in consciousness. And it's like, could you imagine a literary event today in Virginia and Richmond, acknowledging the backs of the slaves on whose labor the country was built? And I think this is what we have to come to terms with, is that we might not be responsible for some of the atrocities of the past, and yet we're complicit, and we continue to benefit disproportionately from some of those decisions. Based on who we are, we have different access to the American dream. And that's contradictory to the very purpose of the American Constitution, I think. And I don't think there's anything wrong with pointing that out. I think, in fact, it's really important part of our job as a citizen to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And that is actually the evolutionary process that we must follow. which is, you know, the evolutionary process is looking back and recognizing, and like you're saying, naming the people that we have heard, recognizing that. So there is so much more I could ask you, but we have gotten to the end of this. What is your final message for the listeners and the viewers?
Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm hearing some kind of background noise. I don't know why. What is that about? Okay, I don't know where that was. Well, I think, thank you so much, Marianela. What a pleasure to spend this time. I do feel like we could continue talking. There's so much to talk about, but my hope is that Correctional, that you read it. Hopefully, I've been told it's a pretty compelling read and a page turner, but that it's not just a literary artifact, that it's something that helps you open your eyes, open your heart, look at where we are as a society and try to get involved in some way. And so in that way, I hope it provides a correctional, not just for myself, but for all of us. Because there's a phrase I use in the book that we're all ineradicably interconnected. And I really do believe that. There's more we could talk about policy and other things, but I think if we shifted towards being more compassionate and inclusive, the net benefits for all of us would be exponential. And so I really hope people enjoy the book, and I'm on the socials at Impurpler, always happy to engage and help in any way I can.
Beautiful. I do hope I can get you back to continue the conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access this episode and any other episodes at Anchor and YouTube. And if you're interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And also, if you find our program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion always, always.